Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. We have taken out the two-seater variety today because I'm joined by co-founder of the podcast. That would be Alexis. Say hi, Lex.
Hello.
We welcome you guys back, and today, okay, you probably already guessed it. Alexis is recording today. Where are we going?
We're going to England.
Except we're not.
Yeah.
So,
We're stopping in England, but then we're jumping to somewhere else.
all right, so we'll explain what that's all about here, and as we've mentioned a number of times, as we close out the show, you're probably tired of hearing us close out the show that way, we encourage you to go to the website. One of the things we encourage folks to do at the website is do what, Lex?
Leave a listener suggestion. Yes, we're going to England, but I did not come up with this topic.
That's exactly right. So we are going to blame, and I don't think blame is the right word, we're going to credit listener Eric Rush, who submitted this topic. By the way, submitted several topics. I'm looking here at the list of the spreadsheet that we maintain topics in. We have over 25 pending topics in the list now, so that's good. Helps us to think through, and some of these are very compelling, very interesting, the types of things we haven't thought about, which is why we do this. So we encourage you to throw it in the mix. Eric is actually going to be joining us soon on an episode to talk about something in particular, so we'll save that. But we found his topic intriguing enough for our recording today that we're going to go ahead and take this on. So, Eric, we hope that we do it justice. So, Alexis, how many female monarchs has England had?
6.
Okay, we talked about this off podcast, or 7. That's all depending on
Yeah.
where you put Lady Jane.
See previous episode on Lady Jane Grey.
Right. But not counting the 9-day reign of Lady Jane Grey sandwiched in between Edward VI and Mary I, there have been 6.
Yes.
2 of those, well, actually probably 3 of them. You can maybe correct me here, but now that I think about it, 3 of them actually sort of hold the tenure for like longest monarch, right? Back to back to back?
Yes.
Yes. Two of them share a name. That name would be...
Well, there's one in the middle. We have the first one, then there's one in the middle, and then the last 2
Yeah.
are the longest.
But the interesting thing about the English monarchy is if you're going to reign for a long time, your odds of doing that are a lot better if you are female. And so up until recently, when Queen Elizabeth II actually took over the position of being the longest reigning monarch, who held that distinction before?
That would be Queen Victoria.
Queen Victoria. And we've already established on this podcast that while Alexis is an Anglophile, Victoria is she's shaking her head left to right, somewhat violently enough that hair is moving. I'll just give you the play-by-play for that. But Queen Victoria is not your favorite English monarch, right, Lex?
No.
No. But she is a well-known English monarch.
Yes.
There's a whole age or era that's named after her, the
Victorian age.
Victorian era. And she reigned from early in the 19th century all the way into the very early first couple of years of the 20th century.
Correct.
And so was known until Elizabeth II surpassed her for being the longest reigning monarch. The other thing that she's known for is what?
That'd be a little genetic medical problem called hemophilia.
All right, and that's actually going to be our point of departure today. What we're going to talk about today is the fact that Victoria appears to be, from modern science, to be the carrier of the recessive genetic component, which leads to hemophilia. And as a result of some things we'll talk about here after the break, that's not just contained to jolly old England.
No, it has some far-reaching consequences.
It has some far-reaching consequences. So when we come back from the break, we're going to pick back up looking at the historical what-if of Victoria, Queen of England, not as a carrier of the gene that leads to hemophilia. So we hope you stick with us and come back after the break. Don Alexis, taking just a quick break from the podcast today to not pitch you something, not try to quote-unquote sell you something, but ask you to do something for us if you would. So, have you ever gone to a restaurant or something, Alexis, that was just absolutely fantastic?
Yes.
What did you do?
Left a review.
Left a review, or you told somebody about it,
Yep.
right? Well, in the nature of the world of podcasting, there's a number of different ways to do that. Most of you get this podcast probably not directly from the organization where we publish it and host it. Some of you may directly link to our Buzzsprout feed there, and there's value to doing that. We think you should do that because you're going to get it directly. But most of you probably get it through what's known as a podcast
Catcher.
a podcatcher, an aggregator. The two most common of those, probably one of the two most famous, are probably Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts.
Yep.
Because the world, particularly the mobile device world, is divided between
Apple and Google.
Apple and Google. But there are a number of different other ones. Stitcher, and there's a number of different podcatchers. You probably have, most of you we know from the statistics that we see, listen to our podcast on a mobile device, and you listen to that through some form of application that does that. Many of those applications and many of the places where you get those podcasts allow you to do two important things. They both begin with an R. What are they, Lex?
Rate and review.
Okay, so what is the value for us getting ratings and reviews?
So, particularly in those podcast aggregators, catchers, whatever you want to call them, is the more ratings and reviews you get when you have somebody that's coming to that app and is just searching for a specific topic, your podcast is going to float to the top.
Right, and so it helps us in the search engines.
Yes.
Which allows us to be found a little bit easier. The other thing is, if somebody encounters our podcast and they're maybe intrigued by the description, but they don't know if they really want to listen to it or not, we all do this when we find something. We look for
Ratings and reviews.
And so if somebody says this is great, or somebody says this is horrible, or you see that the vast majority of them are 5-star reviews, you're more inclined to give it a test. If you see no reviews, what are you inclined to do potentially?
Pass it up.
Pass it over. And so it really does help the podcast a lot if you take the time to deliver a rating or review. I have to say, because I've gone and tried to do this and do it for other podcasts, it's not always easy to do, because you actually have to do some work. But if you would do that, we certainly would appreciate it. Even if that's a negative review, we certainly prefer the 5-star ratings and positive reviews, but it's helpful and it's valuable to us if you would do that. So what do we want to encourage our listeners to do, Lex?
Go on your podcast catcher of choice and rate and review. Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. We've got the 2-seater What If machine out because, as you can probably hear, I'm Alexis, but joining me is...
This is Don.
And as we mentioned before the break, we are going to England, but we're going there for a listener suggestion, so we hope we do this topic some justice. But today we're going to be discussing Queen Victoria and what if Queen Victoria had not carried the recessive gene that ultimately leads to the disease known as hemophilia.
Right. And so I just want to mention here that a good friend of mine that I went to high school with, and I believe she is a listener of the podcast.
I think so.
At least on a regular basis. So shout out to Cassandra.
Yeah, hey Cassandra.
And I'm thinking about her in particular because she has been an advocate for and very involved in modern movements and other things that help hemophiliacs. And the reason for that is she has children who suffer from the condition. And I know from firsthand experience talking to her, even with modern medical science today, hemophilia is...
It's difficult.
It's a difficult and traumatic thing. So a brief description of hemophilia is this. It's the absence of the various mechanisms that allow your blood to clot properly. And so why that becomes a problem is if you cut yourself or if you even bruise yourself or fall or whatever the case might be, and there's bleeding involved, external or internal, and your body doesn't have the ability to stop that bleeding, or that you have, in some cases, I know from her experience, just bleeds that happen for various reasons, it obviously is a life-threatening condition.
Right.
So hemophilia, even today, is something that there's drugs and medications and other things that have come along, but it's still a very difficult condition to live with. During Victoria's era and the era that follows after that, even more so.
Correct.
So it is passed genetically. We're understanding more about it more and more all the time. There's two various flavors of it. The belief, I think now, from most of what I read, is that that Victoria probably carried the B form of this, and we're not going to get off into the science because we can't really do it justice. That would be Eric, who probably could have joined us, who suggested the topic, can definitely probably do that. But again, as Alexis mentioned, it's important to understand this is a recessive trait. So Victoria is known for being, on this podcast, Alexis's least favorite English queen. She's known for being one of the longest reigning English monarchs, only recently eclipsed by Elizabeth II. She's known for what else, Lex?
She's known as the matchmaker and grandmother of Europe.
Okay, so she had lots of kids.
Yes.
She and her husband had lots of kids.
9.
They had 9. And because she reigned for so long and the influence that was there, and she was very active in this, what percentage of the royal houses of Europe somehow touch a descendant of Victoria?
Quite a few. And some of the big ones. Obviously, her son becomes king of England after her, but I mean, it touches Spain, it touches Germany, it touches Russia, and then it touches some minor ones, Brandenburg, Hesse, things like that. But it touches various royal houses of Europe.
Yeah, and in fact, she holds the distinction of, I guess it's 3 of her grandchildren
Hmm.
that are the rulers of various powers that are fighting each other.
Yeah, 3 of her grandchildren go to war with each other.
Yeah, so there's essentially 3 cousins
Yeah.
that are all fighting that represent major powers: England,
Germany,
Germany,
and Russia.
And Russia. And we were talking off podcast about there's a video from one of the history things. We'll put a link in the show notes to this YouTube video that's sort of a singing rendition of the three fighting cousins, which is interesting. We were talking about the fact that 2 of them, I guess that's George of England and Tsar Nicholas of Russia, look like they could be identical twins.
Yeah, it's more than brothers, it's twins.
When you see pictures of them. So the familial resemblance is quite obvious.
Strong.
Even though the fact that they're broken out from there. So what we want to talk about today, again, the point of departure, this is not a podcast today on hemophilia treatments. It's specifically on the impact that was suggested by our listener, by Eric. What if Victoria had not carried the trait, which was then passed down because of her being the matchmaker of Europe in all of these houses? How would that have changed history? And just looking at a quick reference here, there are 9 known male descendants of Victoria who were various form of royalty that died in order of death from 1873 to as late as 1945. We'll come back and touch some of the names here, but I'm just gonna read down their relationship to Victoria. Grandson, son. This is in the order of death. Grandson, son, great grandson, great grandson, grandson, great grandson, great grandson, great grandson, great grandson. Couple of themes there. What gender are all those who have died?
Could be male.
Male. So again, while the trait is passed down from the mother, the female line, it expresses itself in the
male.
In the male. Again, because it's a recessive trait. So it's the fact that it picks up this X-chromosome that's carried through there, but manifests itself in the male children. And so, again, you see that of those 9, they're all males.
Mm-hmm.
So some of those are Prince Leopold, who was her son. So there's how it touches England. There's a Mountbatten in here. There's some, again, mentioned from Spain and from Prussia. But probably of this list that we're looking at, Alexis, who is the most famous of these 9 descendants of Victoria who is stricken with hemophilia?
That would be the Tsarevich of Russia, and mostly he's known as Alexei, but I'd like to point out he's also called Alexis.
Okay, so
in various texts and historical documents, so there's a connection there. But I tend to refer to him as Alexei, which is kind of the Russianization of his name.
And so he is the son of the Russian Tsar, who is Nicholas.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm trying to remember the Tsarina's name.
Alex or Alexandra.
Andrea, right. And so they have a total of 5 children,
Mm-hmm.
4 daughters, and then
Correct.
they have the 1 son.
Correct.
The son is the 5th oldest.
Yes.
The 4 daughters all come first, and so a little bit of the crisis there of, are we going to have a male heir? And they do. Only they discover very young in Alexei's life that he has hemophilia. And so we'll talk about the impact of that moving forward. Sort of important here, and we won't give anything close to justice for this because it can't be done in a short episode. But Russia is unique among the European powers, even of the early part of the 20th century. While there is a legislative body which does meet, and they do have to get some assent from for some things, it's fair to say that the Russian Tsar is still one of the most powerful absolute monarchs that exist in absolute monarchy into the 20th century.
That is 100% correct, yes.
And there are unique economic and political factors, historical and otherwise, that lead up to the fact that in 1917 there's a revolution in Russia which overthrows the Tsar. Well known because of communist Marxists uprising there, the condition of the peasants in Russia, the economy. Again, also not going to focus on that. That's also interesting things to focus upon. But it's very safe to say that what I want to get to here is that having an heir for the Tsar was important.
Correct.
And it's also important to say that, again, the way that the succession worked, because they were sort of an old school kind of monarchy, was 4 older girls, youngest son, who's going to be the heir?
That'd be the son.
That'd be the son. And the fact that he is frail, sickly, and then determined to have this particular condition, what does that lead to?
It leads to the royal family in Russia, the Tsar and the Tsarina, becoming very reclusive. And I think you hit on something very important. He does have 4 older sisters. So it is kind of this, oh my gosh, are we ever going to have a son? Okay, we finally got the son. Good. We're good. And then a couple years later, it's, oh, but he's sick. We've got to do everything we can to protect him. So you see the royal family coming into their shell, becoming more and more reclusive because they're putting all of their energy into making sure that this boy is protected and coddled,
right,
essentially.
And so I think it's a fair thing, and there probably becomes some opinion that gets wrapped into this. I don't think it affects how the Tsar's public perception is well known. He was still the Tsar.
Right.
But you certainly did not have his wife, the Tsarina, as publicly apparent, and you certainly didn't have this youngest heir child. I mean, what I've seen portrayed both in dramatic fictional drama type things or historical fiction drama things, and in documentaries and other things, was, again, protective is the word, coddled is the word I think that you used, that's around him as the son.
Right. I mean, Nicholas is the Tsar, and Nicholas is seen and is respected. But definitely with Alex is focused on making sure that Alexei is okay. So you don't see this kind of unified front of the royal family of the Tsar and the Tsarina together because Alex is so focused on making sure Alexei is fine.
And again, the hemophilia here for Alexei is inherited through Alexandra, and Alexandra's maternal grandmother was
Queen Victoria.
And again, her husband is
Prince Albert.
No, the husband of the Tsarina.
Oh, Nicholas II.
So again, this intermarriage of fairly close relations is what that's why hemophilia is often referred to as the royal disease, because of the tendency to do that among royal families.
Yes.
So going down the historical what if, the point of departure that we're taking is Victoria never has this trait called hemophilia. But we're not going to be talking that much about Victoria. We're going to talk specifically about, we could talk about a lot of the different things. We're going to focus specifically on this one line of errors and how it impacts in Russia.
Mm-hmm.
So the only other thing I wanted to do without going into a lot of the background is, even Victoria being the queen was a little bit of not an expected thing, right?
Right. It was a feat in and of itself. I mean, we talked about there've been, let's say 6. Let's take Jane out of it. There've been 6 queens in all of English history since 1066.
You thrown in the since. We're not gonna go Boudica either. Here,
yeah, so. We're not gonna go back that far. But since 1066, there's been 6. So even getting to Victoria on the throne is a little bit of a feat. And to explain why Victoria is even, would you like me to explain why even Queen Victoria is on the throne?
Yeah, just briefly.
Okay, so Queen Victoria is actually the granddaughter of George III. I remember when I first, that clicked in my head. I didn't put them that close together in my head, but she is the granddaughter of George III. She is the daughter of, don't quote me on this, but I believe it's his 4th son, Edward the Duke of Kent. And the reason she kind of rises to prominence and is next in line for the throne is George III and his wife had 15 children. but through a series of either they died without heirs or they married people who George considered inappropriate. They took themselves out of the line of succession to the point that once you have George the Third's first son dying, George the Fourth, then we have William the Fourth, who's Victoria's uncle. We have him on the throne. There's actually this William the Fourth is focused on, he knows Victoria's the heir, he's trying to hold on until she can turn 18. He does. And Victoria becomes queen simply because she has survived. Her father had a legitimate marriage, and she is the only one that kind of rises up from all of the descendants of George III. There's multiple descendants of George III, but they've taken themselves out of the line of succession for multiple reasons, to the point that Victoria has risen up, and she is now the sole heir to the throne after her uncle, William IV, dies.
So there's really sort of two interesting what-ifs here. Victoria even getting into the position of being queen.
Right.
And then the fact that she actually has this condition, which is not readily apparent to her because she's a carrier of it. It's a recessive gene, and then it passes on because of the way things that connect together.
And importantly, she probably inherited it from her mother.
Correct.
So it was brought into the English royal family.
Right. And it's not until much later, as the descendants start to intermarry,
right,
and the other things that happen there that cause this recessive thing to become noticeable, that they
right,
start tracing back and understanding the linkage there. So the ripple effect is Victoria is queen. You talked about the background for that. That was a little bit of a long shot even there. But then because she is queen, she's put in a position where she's able to be this matchmaker of Europe. And thus, as a result, her progeny blossom
right,
throughout all of Europe. And again, we've already talked about the most notable places there in Russia. So let's talk about a little bit about why this impacts Russian history. So again, we get to 1917. Series of other events have led up to this, but the uprising in Russia, that's the revolution. In fact, it's so much so that Russia withdraws from World War I.
right.
But as we're leading up to that, and now Alexei, who was born in 1904, so he's a young teenager moving into teenager, a lot of conditions, a lot of concern. He's had falls, he's had other things. I mean, again, he's very closely guarded. Is that eventually Nicholas leaves to go to St. Petersburg to be closer to prosecute the war, leaving the Tsarina and the family, mainly Alexei, back now. And because the Tsar is gone, there's really not much of a public face there. And there's the things that are starting to happen, the economic pressures and the other things that ultimately lead to the revolution. And I'm not suggesting that Victoria being carrier of hemophilia leads to the Russian Revolution.
No.
I'm not suggesting that, because there's a lot of other social and economic factors that play into that. But at the time that the revolution comes to be, there's a lot of targeting of the disfavor and the other things from the Russian people, and it's aimed at the Empress or the Tsarina. And what's sort of going on that's unique or different that also draws a lot of the ire of the Russian people about what's going on in the royal household?
Well, because we have Nicholas away dealing with the war, the Tsarina, Alex, is kind of essentially in over her head. She's taking care of her very sick son. She also has 4 daughters that she's taking care of. So she's essentially a single mother with 5 kids, one of them who is very, very sick. So enter this man who you might have heard of called Rasputin.
Yeah, he actually goes by the moniker. I remember the first time I think I heard this attached to him. He's the Mad Monk. So, by the way, if you're called the Mad Monk, you're already an interesting character in history no matter what.
Uh-huh.
But he's, I guess the word I would use to describe him, he's a charlatan. He's sort of this, he's a lot of stuff. I strongly recommend, I think it's The Last Czars, which was done here by Stars, maybe. I can't remember which who actually did that. Maybe it's Hulu, Netflix, somebody. It's out there streaming somewhere. You can find it, and it's not one of the ones we've referenced in the last few episodes. But you sort of get, he's just this incredibly interesting character.
Yeah.
And he is almost like a faith healer type, and so he gains the trust because of some of the things that go on and other things that have happened. He gains the trust of the royal family in terms of his ability to actually either heal or at least protect Alexei.
Yeah, and he does some things that Alexei can't be healed. But he does some things that maybe lessen the symptoms, maybe make it seem like Alexei is being healed. He gets this, surge of vitality and surge in, energy and things like that, to the point that he really ingratiates himself with the Tsarina and earns that level of trust with her.
Yeah. And so what happens here, I'm actually just reading here, this is actually from a Wikipedia article, so it has to be true, right? But it talks about the fact that he becomes this controversial figure. And he becomes this controversial figure during this particular point of time, such that as there's the revolutionary things are stirring, Nicholas is being distracted, he's pulled away because of the war, that there's a lot of people that are actually blaming some of the condition of the country superstitiously on things that they believe are tied to Rasputin. Well, and so this is where the hemophilia plays into history. If Victoria is not Queen of England, if she doesn't carry the hemophilia recessive gene, if she's not the matchmaker of Europe,
right,
where all of her descendants end up intermarrying, which ultimately ends up in what happens with the Russian royal family, which actually ultimately results in Alexei. If he's not sick with hemophilia, there's no reason for Rasputin to be able to get that close to the Russian royal family.
Correct. And also, not going to chase the rabbit of there would have been no World War I if, Victoria hadn't been a hemophiliac or carried the gene. But if you have Nicholas with a healthy son, you would have been seeing Alexei. The Russian people would have been very aware of who was going to be next on the throne. But because he was sick, because he had hemophilia, you don't see him.
Right.
He's this recluse.
Yeah, and so, again, how does this... Well, one of my professors in college said this, and it stuck with me a long time. It's the concept of what's perception and what's reality. And what he said, which was probably not... First time I heard it and listened to it, I'll put it that way, I was old enough to do this, was he said, a widely enough held perception of reality acts like reality. It might as well be. Perception becomes reality if everybody believes the perception is reality, regardless of what the reality actually is. And so, again, the perception that it started to... A number of things arose. There were some that actually superstitiously sort of blamed Rasputin as having this control over the Tsarina and the royal family. Others that, it portrayed in other ways. It made them less publicly visible when they probably needed to be even more
visible,
more publicly visible. So you take all these things that in and of themselves seem pretty small, but do they have the ability to alter history? And so if for some reason there's not the 1917 revolution, World War I comes to an end, maybe as a result of that, actually the end of World War I, we've talked about this on so many episodes, it lays the groundwork for World War II because of the reparations. Maybe Russia gets things ceded from Germany. The economic situation in Russia improves because they're on the winning side of the war versus withdrawing from the war, which is what ultimately happened with the revolution and then the change in government, is you can start to see how this ripples down through time. So it's really critical what happens with the Russian Revolution, and it's, I think, a very fair thing to say that an element of what causes the Russian Revolution to happen does tie back to this perception of the royal family, and the perception of the royal family, again, ties back to
Victoria. Yeah, and again, and I think you mentioned this, not to say the Russian Revolution wouldn't have happened, but maybe the Russian Revolution wouldn't have been successful.
Right. I'm going to actually quote here. This is from one of the more outspoken members of the Duma. The Duma was the Russian
legislative body.
I want to say parliament, but that's saying one thing with another. It was that organization. And so in 1916, this is what he said, that the Tsar's ministers, meaning the people that were around the Tsar, have been turned into marionettes whose threads have been taken firmly in hand by Rasputin and the Empress Alexandra Fedorovna, the evil genius of Russia and the Tsarina, who has remained a German on the Russian throne and an alien to the country and its people. So there was the added impact that the Tsarina came from German extract. That's who they're fighting against. So that's there. They're fighting a war against that. But part of the reason Rasputin has been able to get into their company and embed himself is exclusively and solely, for the most part, because of
Alexei. Yeah, the quote didn't say it was solely in the hands of the Tsarina. It said Rasputin and the Tsarina.
Yeah, and so my point here, the A to B to C connection is all centered around Rasputin, and Rasputin is there, I think,
because of Alexei.
tremendously because of Alexei, and the reason he's able to do that is because Alexei has this condition.
Yep.
And so, ergo, Victoria is responsible for Russia's fall to communism. That's maybe one extreme way you could describe it, but it is the case. It's certainly responsible for what leads to the Russian Revolution. So, we mentioned some of the other families in Europe. Can you think of anything maybe particular about any of those? I'm putting you on the spot here, Lex. We didn't even talk about that off podcast.
I mean, not particularly, but I think it is important to say, we do have this, grandmother of Europe, matchmaker of Europe scenario with Victoria. So I think it's possible that you would have seen even more of the cousins marrying if she hadn't had, like, you have some of those people who were dying young because they had hemophilia. If they never have hemophilia, do they continue on and do they marry one of their other cousins because the family tree continues and the bloodline continues? And is it possible that it kind of circles back around, we get far enough down the family tree that do you have some descendant of the line in Germany or the line in Russia or the line in one of these minor houses marrying back into the English royal family, marrying back into the Spanish royal family, which is a descendant of Victoria. So I think if you don't have the hemophilia, you don't have some of those people dying out younger, I think it's possible that you would have seen kind of this circular family tree of, yeah, we're fifth cousins or whatever it is, but that's far enough down that we can marry back in and kind of continue the line that way.
Right. So there's an impact on a lot of the noble houses of Europe or royal families of Europe, even as those become less important politically over time because of the change in structures, and again, absolute monarchies, including in Russia,
right,
don't exist anymore. Actually just changed to something else because they had absolute rulers. They just weren't called czars. Yes. But you can see how this plays through, and again, it becomes very important, and even so much so that towards the latter part of her life, again, the connection had been made behind how this probably tied back to Victoria, and I think that changed, again, some of the marital connections between the houses, again, but now they were fearful of this.
Right.
And so that plays through there. So,
this was also an episode of Doctor Who.
Okay, so there you go. That makes it even better.
So there is a pop culture connection here too.
Pop culture connection. So we go from there. Anything else you want to say about this topic, Lex?
This was an interesting one. I hate to call it a fun one because we are dealing with a medical disease that we know people who this actually impacts to this day. But yeah, this was a good one, and it is one of those things that something in one part of the world ultimately having it's that butterfly effect of something in one part of the world having a huge impact on something in another part of the world, and you really have to think about it to connect, and it's like, oh, there is actually a cause and effect there. Right,
and how much cause and how much one effect you want to, again, because this is not the only thing that causes the Russian Revolution. Right. But you can argue that, again, if the Russian Revolution were delayed or perceived, all the things that could be there, again, the butterfly effect just inside of Russia that's coming from the butterfly effect from 60 years previous, I guess it is, give or take, is an interesting thought there. So we want to thank Eric Rush. Again, he was the listener that suggested the topic, which also is a great segue to say, if you're a listener, particularly if you're a long-time listener, we always want to say the most important thing that we can say, which is thank you. But in addition to that, we certainly encourage you to go to the website, which is www.aforkintimepodcast.com. You'll find a number of things there. One of the things you will find there is suggest a topic. And we also should indicate that for our Patreon supporters, we do give those supporters preferential treatment when it comes to their topics, but it's not the only way to suggest a topic. So if you're also interested in supporting the podcast, you can do that by visiting the website and checking out our Patreon link. But all kinds of other good stuff is there at the website, the back catalog, just all the good stuff that's there. Anything you want to say to listeners before we sign off, Lex?
I think you covered it. Also, actually, yes, I'd be remiss in my job if I didn't mention we're also on social media.
Yeah, what's this social media crap all about?
So, social media is a great way for you to get in touch with us. We do monitor our Facebook, our Twitter pages, so you can reach out to us. I remember I commented back on something on Facebook, and it was like, oh, you actually answered me. Yes, I actually monitor the Facebook page, and I'll answer you if you comment on something. But it's also a way for you to share the podcast with other people that you might know that you would think find it interesting. So we always share the post with the new episode for the week. So if you know somebody who you think would find that particular episode interesting, be sure to share it with somebody.
And the other thing I just want to mention there real quick was, Alexis, do you have any idea what I was drinking coffee out of this morning?
I'm gonna guess because you showed me when I got to your house, because apparently I have one coming too. That would be our Fork in Time coffee mugs?
That was a Fork in Time coffee mug. So if you've been dying to consume, it doesn't have to be coffee, it could be tea. Again, if you're really an Anglophile and don't believe in that
the one drink I don't drink.
Yeah, that vulgar thing called coffee. But I just mentioned this because we also have merchandise now. If you're interested in doing that, no way to promote the podcast. And so I have my first Fork in Time coffee mug. There's other things that are there, so that's another link that you can find on the podcast. But regardless of all those things, as we always want to do, we want to thank you most for your support. And just giving us your time to listen is something that we value and something that we appreciate. I think this is actually going to be episode 91 when it actually goes out. And so we are getting really, really, really close to episode 100. It's hard to believe that when we started this little exercise, I guess I knew it could go on, but I hadn't really thought through that it would last through episode 91. So hopefully we're doing something right. All right.
We're going to have to do a look back. We skipped over 75.
Yeah, because you don't need to do a look back every time you hit a major mark. But I think
but I think 100 warrants one.
100 is a good retrospective. And then also, as we mentioned here, we have some new things, exciting things that are coming in the year. Chris Coppola has joined as a regular contributor and some of the other things that are there. So I could tease more, but I'm not going to tease more because I'll tease more later. So once again, we thank you for joining us today. And we're just going to remind you, as we always do, if you happen to be going down the road and you happen to hit a fork in time, we just have one thing that we suggest that you do.
Take it.
All right. Have a great day, guys.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more about the podcast at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Join us next time.